at the beginning. And then I'll basically give you a sense of what we're going to cover this morning and in the afternoon. So here at CEU I teach in the Department of International Relations and European Studies, as well as in the Department of Political Science. My main interests lie at the interface of international relations and comparative politics. I started working on Central Asia some 15 years ago, and back then what was driving my interest was an attempt to make sense of intercommunal conflict and violence. Particularly, I was trying to figure out why, given similar conditions, some locales were seem to be more prone to an escalation to conflict and violence, whereas others in the same region were not. So there was a comparative interest in this. Over time, my interest have evolved a bit to broader international security challenges. International security, particularly human security, and particularly what is interesting me at the moment is water politics in the region, not so much as a standalone challenge, as you will see and hear me speak, and as you see the discussions evolve today, but in terms of how it is intertwined with a number of other challenges that Central Asian societies and the Central Asian states face. So this intertwined nature of the challenges, or this nexus between different types of security challenges, is what interests me at the moment. Before we go any further, just for me to have an idea of what I'm talking to, how many of you are from Central Asia? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many of you are not from Central Asia but are working in or on Central Asia? All right. How many political scientists or IR people are in the room? 5. Economics? Public policy? Environmental studies? Probably not see. All right, okay, that's fine. So, well, I suspect that those of you that are either from the region or worked on the region may have heard some of what I'm about to say many times before. If I tend to go over things that you're already familiar with, bear with me while I do, and hopefully I will be able to add something to it, either in terms of the way in which the issues are framed theoretically or the empirical parts. I'll try to touch on some theoretical issues and some empirical parts, and I will try to complement these with what you could refer to as recollections, memories, vignettes from the region that go back to some of my travels to Central Asia. I tend to visit the region whenever I can. That normally means about 3 or 4 times a year. Other commitments permitting. So, couple of quick things to start. What is? Yeah. Okay, I should have asked. Where is it? Yep. Okay. That was relatively easy. So that's one of the 3 madrasas that form the complex of the Registan, which is one of the main squares in the city of Samarkand, Uzbekistan. What do we have up there? That could be at least 3 different countries. So, but still, where do you think that was taken? Okay, 4 then. It has to do with pastures and herdsmen, but that's not Mongolia. It's one of the plateaus in the mountainous part of Kyrgyzstan, as the Gerd suggested. What about this?
That's Tajikistan.
Yeah, that's one of the plateaus in the eastern part of Tajikistan. Let me see if I can manage to mess up this. The one on the left, that should also be quite straightforward. There should be a lot of water, and yet there isn't. What you should be seeing, okay, maybe the picture is not great, and the resolution doesn't help. But yes. So what you should have seen here, the cliffs at the port city of Moynak in, again, western Uzbekistan. What you see, steel cliffs, actually you see rocks, and from the rocks you see plants. Because that's what you see for dozens and dozens of kilometers from the southern shore of the Aral Sea. And on the right you see the Lavi House, that is the center of the city of Bukhara in Samarkand. Alright, what I will focus on is essentially the Amudarya-Sirdarya water basin in Central Asia, which extends over a large part and yet not all of Soviet Central Asia. The republics of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan fall within this basin, and so does the southern part of Kazakhstan, the area around Jammu, Shymkent, and the part that extends and reaches out to the Aral Sea, or what is now the northern Aral Sea, given that the sea is pretty, the lake is de facto split in two. Outside of the borders, or outside of what is traditionally understood as post-Soviet Central Asia, or Central Asia as a whole, is Afghanistan, that yet falls within the Amudarya's river basin, and therefore I touch on that partly in what I say. So, the first session touches on water politics, and that should take us up to 11 at the very least. I have something more to say about water politics, so there may be some spillover when I touch on questions of water governance into the second session. The second part of this morning will deal more with food security and particularly about the water, energy, food security nexus. Before we go any further, what's public good? Yep.
It's a good which is non-excludable and non-rival. Non-excludable means that you cannot exclude others from consuming this good, and non-rival means that consumers are not rivals in consumption. So these goods cannot be provided by the market because it's unprofitable.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, of course. The lighthouse is a lighthouse. It can be an example. Street lighting, police, defense.
Others?
It's a common property resource.
Do you know in terms of examples?
Maybe a grazing land.
Would air count as a public good?
Yes.
Water?
Yes.
Security?
Water, it depends.
It should be.
Water, it depends. Yeah.
Depends on what?
No, in some society, you have private, people investing in bottled water, and so it's not a public good. Like, the individual invests money into it and controls it, determines where to sell it, how to sell it. So it's no longer public.
Is there a better term to capture what water is?
Maybe quasi-public.
Qualifiers always come handy. And what's a private one?
A good that is not public.
Yes, it's excludable and rival. Yeah.
Examples?
Examples. Pizza, a slice of pizza. If I consume it once, you don't consume it. So it's excludable. I can exclude you from consumption if I buy it. And it's rival because we are rivals in consumption. If we are at reception, there is only one slice of pizza. We are rivals. Yeah, we cannot consume it again and more like lighthouse. That's why I see lighthouse doesn't prevent you from seeing, but that doesn't work with pizza. If I eat it, then you are hungry.
And some people are more rivalrous than others when it comes to pizza.
Yeah.
I was brought up in Italy and I have an almost religious attitude to that particular. Yeah.
I think one factor that is distinguishes between public and private is the issue of profitability. Yeah, if you look at public use, their production are basically not built around making profit, but it's a kind of welfare. But private use are predominantly profit motivated. That's it.
Thank you. And finally, a term that has been very common in a concept that has been very common in economics and more recently in public policy, and since Elinor Ostrom has been also appropriated by political science in whole side 2, is that of common pool resources. What are these?
Maybe countries that keep water resources.
Like share one.
It's not coming, it came naturally, but it's like artificially made abuse.
It could be human, a type of resource that has a human component to it, but it could be a natural resource
But
management.
can it be just water again?
Yeah, that's what okay, no, go ahead, please.
Because we have the same approach like Volga River. Of course, it's not different countries, but it's different region of Russia, and Volga has the same approach, so it's common pool resource. As I suppose so, and maybe the same with these Amudari and Sirdarya.
Are there particular features of this type of resources that perhaps make them different from public goods?
Owned by community or common ownership is a feature of common pool resource.
Can you exclude people from the use of this type of resources?
No, but you can regulate them, or the community regulates.
There are particular type of regimes, you're right, yeah.
Yesterday we had a lecture and we had a reference of Elinor Ostrom's work, where it was highlighted that how the community would regulate fishing, if I'm not, if I would get it wrong. So, and if somebody would kill a small fish, then there would be a slap on the hand, but if somebody would kill a big fish for private gain without the community knowing, then there would be certain restriction, certain punishment or punishment of that sort. So probably common resource goods are managed by a community or a group of people, and they regulate as to how it has to be used.
There were a couple of other people that presumably want to add.
Another common feature with common resources are they are usually transboundary. And they can move the usage could cause conflicts too. So there are usually limitations on how resources from that common rivers are used. So they're usually transboundary, they are not owned by any particular group of people. But by different, they could be used by different people and could easily be a source of conflict.
Thank you, good. You had a point as well?
You asked what's the difference between common resources and public goods. Well, my guess is that in theory, public goods are endless. You can consume them again and again, right? But maybe common pool resources are not. They can end at some point in the future. Yeah, like yes, no.
What I had in mind was not the finite nature of the resources, but the cost, which is high, and yet can be imposed to some of the communities or countries that share these resources, so that this could be excluded by this. And what I had in mind was exactly transboundary river water flows, that is the rivers, like the Amudari and the Sirdarya. So resources that are shared, and yet these are type of resources where it's very, very difficult, and yet it's not impossible to cut some of the parties that should benefit from the use, access, allocation, management of these resources. All right, so that's as we have a starter. Let's just move on to what I had in mind actually. So the first part deals with water politics. I'll give a bit of context, and those that are more familiar with Soviet economy and and the legacy of the command economy, in fact, doesn't have to be Soviet, it's to be centralized, will be familiar with some of the challenges that were left by the implosion of the Soviet state, and that the new independent states in the early 1990s had to face and deal with. I'll highlight some flashpoints of tensions. So I'll look at the usual relationship between water and conflict. I'll focus on a few cases, macro and micro. And that should lead me nicely to a fairly interesting empirical puzzle, that is, given the context, the conditions that existed in the 1990s, the region that we're looking at today, Central Asia, should have been quite full of conflict. Fortunately enough, the number of conflicts over resources were very limited, and they remain limited to a very micro scale, particularly in border regions. This is not to underestimate this type of conflicts, far from it, especially because the communities that were affected from this conflict suffered tremendously, and in some cases there were deaths. But there were no resource wars as such on an interstate basis. Very often conflicts are micro, and very often the flashpoints are within individual states, to the point that some scholars suggest that intrastate war or conflicts are more likely than interstate ones in the region. And I'll end up with something on water governance in the region. Before moving further, I'll take some time, hopefully not too long now, to highlight some of the, well, to recollect some of the experiences from some of the travels, and ideally what I want you to get out of this is a sense of how uneven the playing field is in the region in terms of the challenges that exist, so the diversity between countries, the evolution over time, that is the emergence of, well, the implementation of policies aimed at tackling some of these challenges, as well as the carelessness of some countries towards some of these challenges. So let me start off with one of my first trips to Uzbekistan, and this actually happened in Samarkand in '98 and happened again in 2001. What I was doing in Samarkand was trying very simply to learn both Uzbek and Tajik language there. Now forget the how do you put it? The lack of wisdom that comes from the idea of learning two languages at the same time in the middle of a very hot summer. So, needless to say, things didn't quite work out as planned. There were good intentions back then. So anyway, so moved to Uzbekistan for about 3 months during the summer, stayed with the Uzbek family, and then had Uzbek classes in the morning, Tajik in the afternoon. Got back. Uzbekistan gets very hot in the summer, as I'm sure you're all aware. So you get back home in a state of near total dehydration, and you head straight for the tap. The good thing about Samarkand is that tap water is drinkable and it's actually pretty good. So I thought, okay, get some water. Alright, then gets to the sunset, totally knackered, I go to bed and fall asleep. Wake up again in a state of total dehydration at about 2 or 3 in the morning, head straight for the courtyard. I was staying in a traditional Uzbek family, the Hovli, so there's a courtyard, there are trees, the building basically has a square shape. Across the courtyard, head for the small fountain. The fountain is open, the tap is open. Alright. Thought, well, that's convenient for me. I was super sleepy. So I had myself, closed the tap, as I would normally do at home. Head back home, head back to my room. 2 hours later, wake up again. Head back, the water is running. I thought, oh, that's a bit weird. This habit tends to repeat itself on a daily basis, in fact, every night. And it went on for quite a while, it went on for the entire summer in '98, and when I went back again to Samarkand in 2001, again it was happening. And I was doing exactly the same thing. Get up, head there, help myself, switch off the tap. The thing is that I started to notice other things, as the tap was right next to the kitchen, was that while the night was actually quite pleasant in Samarkand, which is on a plateau, so there's quite a high difference between day and night, kitchen was so hot, or at least the heat that was coming out of the kitchen was so hot that I thought that I had just landed on the sun. So heading to the kitchen, the gas is running. So there I have a puzzle. Normally I stay away from gas and gas taps in order not to make a mess. I didn't want to blow myself and the family out. So I thought, well, however much I find this bizarre, I just leave the gas on. So several nights later, I bring this up with the family, and they said, well, look, don't you find it weird that you have quite a lot of water and you don't care about switching it off, especially given that there are a couple of issues that are attached to water scarcity or mismanagement, misallocation in that very country, Uzbekistan. So, yeah, but who cares? There's plenty of water in Samarkand and we don't pay for it. Right. We don't pay for water, we don't pay for gas. So that started to point me to some of the issues. I then started to travel westwards because I wanted to see the RLC or the remains of the RLC, and basically I bumped into the very sorry landscape that you've seen in one of the earlier slides, there where you should have seen water. You saw abandoned ships, trees that were far higher, far taller than a human being, trash. You could basically drive through the lake, or in fact, on the ground. I then returned in 2002 in the winter, not that smart either, to Tashkent in 2002, and that time I found that there was a very different approach to utilities, or at least the use of utilities, in the sense that water taps this time were more sealed, shall we say, and that gas was not open all the time in the kitchen. You would switch on the gas when you needed it for cooking, and then you would switch it off. Surprise, surprise, it was the government had in the meantime introduced charges for utility bills. Unsurprisingly, that led to change in behavior. Moving on, and moving east of Uzbekistan, I then started to travel to the smaller mountainous republics of Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And there, what I found bizarre was that there were problems with running water in the two countries from which 90% of Central Asia's water comes from. You could see some sort of justification in the case of Dushanbe. Tajikistan, as I'm sure you're all aware, went through a fairly bloody civil war between 1992 and 1997, which basically devastated the infrastructure, including the water pipe. So basically what was happening when I wanted to take a shower in Dushanbe in 2003 was that I had to switch on the water and then let it run for about half an hour, so that all the sand basically would just disappear, the color of the water would go back to its transparent nature, and then after half an hour it was fine. In a city where, at the bottom of a sort of a kazan, almost a walk, where you're basically surrounded by the roof of the world, it was very weird to see that kind of a predicament, shall we say. Moving away from water as such and moving to what you can do with water, that is to generate electricity, I was stuck in the dark in the fall of 2008 in Bishkek when I was in town to do a couple of workshops at the American University of Central Asia, where I do some work when I go to Kyrgyzstan. And there what was at some point ironic, but actually tragic, was that electricity had been rationed. And it was a very hard winter, and I'll come to this in the second session this morning, both in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which led to the rationing of heating and electricity as well. Some countries had a slightly worse time, namely Tajikistan, where basically in the winter between 2007 and 2008, people were having 2 hours of electricity a day. There was some more planning in Bishkek, so that the local administration had divided the city neighborhoods, and there was a plan, so that people would know that between 6 and 8 in the morning you would have that thing, that you would have no electricity in that district, then it would move. And I found myself moving from one district to the other. The situation was probably something along the lines of Murphy's Law. I was waking up without hot water and electricity, trying to get through this particular problem, looking forward to moving to a different neighborhood, only to find out that the moment I reached that neighborhood, that was that neighborhood's turn to deal with no hot water and electricity. Moving on, as this is taking slightly longer than I had thought. Visiting the district of Laylek in the Batken province of southwestern Kyrgyzstan, at the border with Tajikistan. That's basically the southwestern part of the Fergana Valley. I didn't have problems with access to water. That was enough water for everybody. I had no problem with electricity either. But what was striking was that on more than one occasion you had the bed of the river belonging to one country and the bridge and surrounding territory belonging to a different one. Or in fact, the same road, except one lane belonging to Tajikistan and the other lane belonging to Kyrgyzstan. So while we were driving right next to the border on Kyrgyz territory, and when the car wanted to overtake, it was basically overtaking to Tajik territory. And that's not unusual in that part of Central Asia, and that's definitely not unusual in other parts of the world. Except that this obviously creates a problem if you have different villages that are physically located on Kyrgyz territory, whose resources, however, technically and legally belong to Tajikistan. This was not supposed to be a problem, and in fact it was never a problem under Soviet times. The problem is, when the command economy and the Soviet state collapsed, problems started to arise. So, as a way of an introduction to the hydrological situation in the region, what you have is basically four main rivers. Two are the largest one and the longest one, longest and those largest amount of water flow, and these are the Amudarya and the Sirdarya. The two other smaller rivers that flow in Central Asia are the Zarafshan and the Murrab, and the smaller one, what smaller? And those that do not flow into the Aral Sea but flow northwards are the Ili and the Irtysh. The Ili River flows into Lake Balkhash in Kazakhstan, and the Irtysh flows into the Arctic Ocean. The Amudarya originates from the confluence of two rivers that originate in Tajikistan, namely the Baksh and the Panj River. The Panj is the river that marks the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And the Baksh River is the river that normally that makes the headlines because of the large number of dams that are built on that particular river. The dams, as we will see later today, are a bone of contention because one country sees them as the gateway to energy independence, whereas the other country, neighboring country, sees them as posing a threat to its economy and to its agricultural and non-agricultural sector. So Tajikistan contributes about 80% of the flow of the Amudarya. Afghanistan, about 8%. Uzbekistan a bit less, Kyrgyzstan even less, and then Turkmenistan and Iran contribute about 3%, although most of this is actually coming out of Iran. About 0.2% of Turkmenistan, of the water that flows through Turkmenistan, originates on Turkmen soil. The Sirdarya is much longer, and it flows from the Tian Shan mountain range in Kyrgyzstan. It flows through and crosses Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. If Tajikistan is so to say the largest contributor to the Amudarya, Kyrgyzstan is the largest contributor to the Sirdarya. So, as we were saying earlier on, the Central Asian rivers, and particularly the Amudarya and the Sirdarya, are transboundary water flows. And they illustrate a particular type of common pool resources and the problems that are associated with this type of resources. The first is the problem of appropriation. That is, it relates to the benefits consumed by one member, and the fact that second problem is that of provision, and that has to do with the operation and the maintenance of the resource delivery system. All right. While the problems of use, appropriation, management, distribution emerged suddenly in all their strengths and their dramatic nature in the winter between 1991 and 1992, that is when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's impossible to understand why this was the case without obviously looking at the context, and the context is obviously the Soviet period. The Russian Empire expanded southwards and eastwards in order to reduce its independence from British American cotton, and this drove the Russian conquest of the region, which happened in two waves actually. The first in the 1700s, although the cotton-related issue is something that arose in the 19th century, and that's when the Russian Empire, Tsarist Empire, expanded southwards up to the border with Afghanistan, where it basically almost met with the British Empire. This all led to the emergence of a number of metaphors like that of the Great Game, but that's a separate story. The issue here is that the quest for cotton, what was driving the Russian conquest of Central Asia, as well as the access to foodstuff, fruits and vegetables in the region, and more generally raw resources. Oil and gas became of concern a bit later. The collapse of the Tsarist Empire did not lead to a diminished importance of Central Asia. It led to a redefinition of its importance to the economy. An economy that was centralized, driven by Moscow or the concerns of the plan, and built on the specialization, so that each republic and each republic's economy could only become meaningful as a part of a whole, but not on its own terms. That is to say that the institutional and economic reorganization of the Soviet space led to the creation of these 15 union republics, which existed on paper, on a map, had different colors, as all the states have on a map. But in paper, but in reality, were never designed to be independent. They were never designed to be independent politically. They were never designed to be independent in terms of their economic viability. Economic concerns were one of the criteria used by the Soviets to split up the Soviet space as they did. You had some ethnic drivers or ethnic criteria. Most, if not all, the Union republics were created as homeland of one particular ethnic group. And although this is debated in the literature, based on the work of ethnographers, the Soviets in the end did try to match ethnic and political borders. With some mismatch, and the mismatch are more evident in Central Asia and in other parts of the post-Soviet space. The second criterion was economic. As I said, what was important was the whole, was the plan, was the central economy. That said, each part or piece of the mosaic was supposed to have its own economic viability, at least on paper. So while originally southern Kyrgyzstan, particularly what would become the Osh Oblast, the Osh province, was allocated to Uzbekistan, the region was swiftly reallocated to Soviet Kyrgyzia, because without Osh, which was the most industrialized part of Soviet Kyrgyzia in the 1920s, the country would have been rural and had no industrial base. The situation obviously changed over the decades with the industrialization of Jalalabad and Bishkek as well. But there was an economic rationale as well. So in principle, each of the Union Republic was supposed to have its own economic viability. But as I said, that was supposed to be on paper, was never supposed to be in practice. This obviously became a problem when the whole mosaic fell apart. And because of the collapse of the command economy and the collapse of the monoculture, or better, the collapse of the plant led to fundamentally the uselessness of the specialization and the monoculture, since very few of the post-Soviet states were then able to be economically viable. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought, as known, economic and social hardship, which communities tried to cope with in a very simple way, by leaving cities and moving back to the countryside. So the ruralization of what was already a rural society in Central Asia meant that some of the centers that used to be more industrialized were being hollowed out, and the population was moving towards self-subsistence or self-sufficiency in the agricultural sector. So in a nutshell, back to farming became the strategy for coping. This was happening while the region was going through a very rapid population growth. Again, this was the late 1980s, early 1990s, where some families in rural Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, had even up to 8 or 9 kids. This is no longer the case. Numbers are down. But the background here is that, so basically, you have the collapse of the command economy. You have the population that retreats to the countryside. You have a rapid population growth. And then you have an agricultural sector which itself is unable to sustain the population as a result of poor choices that have been made in previous decades. For example, the lack of investment in the infrastructure. Some of the canals that were used to irrigate land in the region were so poorly maintained that by the time the canal reached the plant that was supposed to irrigate, there was hardly any water in the canal in the first place. The other reason, so the main problem that the region was facing at a macro level was that of a collapse of a plant. This was a bit of a problem because of the economic structure of the region, which had been very strongly tilted towards irrigated agriculture, the promotion and the boosting of the cotton economy in Soviet times, and that on the whole had created a system that was strongly skewed in favor towards the downstream countries. So water in Central Asia flows from the southeast to the western part. You have upstream countries, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. You have downstream countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. For economic purposes, and because of the role that those republics played in the command economy, most of the water resources had been channeled to, and therefore were requested from, the downstream countries. The downstream countries were larger, more populous, even stronger militarily, Uzbekistan in particular, Kazakhstan to some extent. And that created a situation whereby the region very much represented a no-brainer case for cooperation. Command economy collapses, but you still have transboundary river flows, you have common pool resources. Everybody needs these resources for different purposes, of course. Some for rice plants, others for cotton plants, others to generate electricity. But these were basically water flows that were present throughout the region, they were crossing border. There was a system in place that was inherited from the Soviet Union. So this was in principle an idiot-proof case for regional cooperation. Turned out that, as is often the case, no-brainers actually become extremely complicated. What is the no-brainer in theory becomes very difficult to turn in practice. So the Soviet system of management of resources saw an arbiter, so a system that was externally designed, externally driven, centrally administered, and had Moscow as an arbiter. It's not a normative assessment of the role that Moscow or Russia played in the Soviet system. I don't frankly care about that. It could have, some parts of Russia suffered as much as Central Asia from the mismanagement of the Soviet economy, so it's not something about Moscow itself. But nonetheless, in the command economy, you need the center was embodied by Moscow. So Moscow was an arbiter, and there was a system which was a quota system, a fixed system whereby each country, each republic's economy, would know how much water it could draw from the river, what it could use it for. The collapse of the plan meant that the arbiter was gone. Moscow was gone. There was no third party anymore. You only had parties to this problem. In a context where there were greater demands on water, there were more population, there were greater inefficiencies, and there were no other rules. So the consequences of the Soviet command economy were an imbalance between downstream and upstream countries in terms of the amount, in terms of the access to water, how much water they had access to. Consider that 0.4% of the water that was flowing from Kyrgyzstan eventually was used on Kyrgyzstan territory, while 11% in the case of Tajikistan. That's frankly, that was in Soviet times. The situation is marginally improved now. But what you have is a very stark picture where you have the poorer and the weaker countries that have more water and yet have no access to that water, and the stronger ones that basically need water for basically their economy. So imbalances between countries and imbalances in terms of what water could be used for, cotton versus electricity or cotton versus heating, which again in Soviet times was not a problem because not only there was a quota system, not only the system was managed from Moscow, but it was a barter system whereby Tajikistan couldn't care less about the water that flowed through its country, because it would get as compensation for its water, gas supplies, that is heating from Uzbekistan. So, on top of macro level problems, there were micro level problems that affected the everyday life of ordinary Central Asians, and we're talking about 45 to 50 million in the early 1990s and about 60 about now, which have to do with radioactive waste in some parts of the region, the Aral Sea, the eastern part of Kazakhstan, around the Semey-Semipalatinsk polygon, the Malisu region in southern Kyrgyzstan, and other parts of southern Kyrgyzstan, uranium waste. So choices that have been made in the 1920s and 30s and that have been implemented throughout 70 plus years of Soviet life and Soviet economy left a legacy in terms of the climate and environmental conditions that affected Central Asia after independence and that are going to affect Central Asia for years to come. Fairly active. So, what were the issues that the Central Asian states and societies were facing in the 1990s when the Soviet economy collapsed? The first was a question that surrounded the question of water scarcity, and this is something that this is an issue that has been put to rest recently, but it has actually animated debates in the policy circles and academic circles for quite some time. Now, one would be forgiven for believing that there's hardly any water in Central Asia when driving along the Amdarian-Sirdarya, for example, on the Uzbek-Turkmen border, you hardly see any water, or at least you see an increasingly little amount of water as you proceed westwards. You don't see any water at all in the southern Aral Sea. would obviously have a very different impression if you started to do some hiking in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. So the question was, what is the problem with Central Asian water? I mean, does Central Asia have enough water or not? Because obviously the responses that are needed vary tremendously depending on what the answer to this question was. Now we know that water is geographically concentrated. We know that water was and is unequally distributed. There were debates between those that were arguing that the problems with Central Asia and Central Asia's water had to do with the scarcity, that is the lack of water. That's something that geographers like Sarah O'Hara, for example, were arguing in the 1990s, whereas others like Stuart Horsman, looking at questions of environmental security in Central Asia, were suggesting that, and the consensus has really tilted in this direction over time, that water is far from scarce in Central Asia. Water is not scarce. Water is plenty. The problem is that it is mismanagement. So the question is distribution and mismanagement rather than absence or not. Again, of course, on the ground, one could be forgiven for believing that there is no water at all, especially if you're trying to take a shower and there is no water. The second, so the first problem was a question of the identification of the problem itself, scarcity or mismanagement. The second was something that actually animated, that brought in a lot of international interest in the region, or particularly in some of the flashpoints in the region, the most dramatic of which, there were two, the other being the nuclear polygon in St. Balinsk. Really what was driving the action of non-state actors, international NGOs primarily, but also intergovernmental organizations, was the fate, the predicament, and the destiny of what used to be one of the world's largest bodies of water, namely the Aral Sea, which is located basically at the border between or which is shared by Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. What you see on the left was the shape of the Aral Sea in the late 1950s, and what you see with plenty of yellow towards the right part of the slide is what the Aral Sea looks like today. That is a body of water that has shrunk to 1/4 in terms of not only on surface, but also the amount of water that is available there. There are a number of other problems that surround the Aral Sea. The fact that all the variety, thousands of fish species that were available in the Aral Sea over decades vanished. So the Aral Sea in the early 2000s was basically dead. But sometimes it seems what is dead can be brought back to life, which is what happened to the North Aral Sea. So over time, because of the desiccation and desertification, the Aral Sea split up into two. The South Aral Sea, which was dead and remains dead, very much so, whereas the North Aral Sea, located in Kazakhstan, has basically been brought back to life. And basically the fate of the Aral Sea is something that drove environmental and political concern about Central Asia, the legacy of the policies enacted in the 20th century, and the ecological catastrophe. There were other areas of tensions, some fairly silly but no less tragic, and other that could have potentially escalated into interstate wars. Let's start with the silly ones. That's again because silly or bizarre or clownesque situations make the headlines more than the serious situations. And that was the project of the late Safar Murat Niyazov, Turkmenbashid, the former president of Turkmenistan, that had the bright idea of building, wanted to materialize, the so-called Golden Lake in the middle of the Turkmen desert. There was another project that wanted to build a Dubai-style ice palace, again in the desert. This is silly, and it was silly even by Niyazov standards, so the idea never really went anywhere. what was less seen was that there's an important water reservoir in the border area between Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan that belongs to Uzbekistan but is located on Turkmen territory. And given that both countries have strong demands on the water of the Amudarya, that actually was a much more serious bone of contention, especially since interstate relations between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan until very recently were very tense. So that at some point in 96, 97, there were serious concerns about a possible intervention of the Uzbek army on Turkmen territory to basically swallow the reservoir. That didn't happen, but there was a much more serious issue that plagued the relations between the two states. Water-related problems also contaminated, I would say, relations between other countries for very different reasons. In the case of Uzbekistan on the one hand and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan on the other, because the countries needed water for very different purposes. Farming and cotton in the case of Uzbekistan, and in order to generate electricity in the other case. Conflicts and tensions existed within countries as well, and that's unsurprisingly the case of the larger of these countries, with water that could be used for farming purposes in eastern Uzbekistan, particularly in the Fergana Valley, whereas the demand in the central and the western part of Uzbekistan is more for the cotton fields. So there were tensions between countries, and there were tensions within countries as well. I'll get to questions of regional water governance in a second, but first, let me just say that with the collapse of a centralized resource management system, which is a slightly incorrect sentence in the sense that the system remained in place. It was not really respected, but most crucially, what was missing was the enforcer, Moscow. So the countries, as you will hear shortly, actually continued to abide by the Soviet-era agreement. There were problems with the fact that there was no longer to enforce this agreement. So, with the emergence of yet one of the many regional organizations and agreements that mushroomed in post-Soviet Central Asia, where in the name of the friendship of peoples, eternal friendship, common purpose, unity of the region, the presidents of the various republics pledged to cooperate. The practice was that each republic went on its own course and basically took its own destiny in its own hands, which meant one simple thing: the development of national water policies, national development policies. This led Tajikistan, for example, to look around for investment in its dams, meaning investment in the upgrading, renovation, and construction of new hydropower stations, which would have allegedly led to the production of electricity, which in a not too remote future would have led the country to become energy secure, and in a slightly more remote future, 2025 onwards, would have led the country to become one of the world's greatest exporters of electricity. So a number of projects started to be identified in Tajikistan, and investment was sought. There was no liquidity as such, there was no local money basically that could be poured in these projects. Sangtuda 1 and Sangtuda 2 are the main power stations, one funded by Russia and the other one with Iranian money. The irony of all this is that external actors split their contributions onto different projects, so that instead of bringing one project to completion by pooling resources, speaking about common resources, what you have is very small contributions by different countries to different projects. So you don't have Chinese money, World Bank, Asia Development Bank, European money and Russian money all coming together to complete the Lagoon project. What you have is Chinese money on one project, the Iranian money on Sangtuda 2, the Russians on Sangtuda 1, and no money for Lagoon. before I move further to this, to water governance, do we have questions so far?
We normally have, we've put some 20, 30 minutes for questions and answers. So we finish at 11. And
all right. So I'll, if there's anything that is so pressing that life cannot continue without interest. Okay. Because there was no shortage of predictions by analysts in the early 1990s about the looming war over resources in Central Asia. And while all hydrocarbons have come to dominate the Central Asian economy so much that when we speak about resource conflicts or war or competition in Central Asia, what we have in mind now is actually competition over oil and gas, and particularly in the Caspian region. In the early 1990s, the expectation was that if the Central Asian republics were to go to war, they would go to war over water. And as I said, there was not such an unrealistic scenario. 5 countries with no prior experience of independent statehood, at least not within the current boundaries, found themselves without the arbiter or the enforcer. They found themselves without expertise of running their own country and polity, and a national economic policy and strategy to be developed almost overnight. So what you have here is a water, which is obviously a non-substitutable resource. We all tend to need it. It is frequently shared, and that's an understatement. And it is kind of required for all human activities. There were a number of conditions that suggested that these common pool resources really could have brought the region to a war. Fortunately enough, it didn't, and why it didn't is one of the puzzles here. So questions, one of the reasons why countries could go to war, and that's what we get from the literature, and in terms of security, political science, economics, is that this is determined by the degree of scarcity. And again, if you go back to the point I was making earlier about Central Asian water, this was something that was suggested by all those that seem to believe or argue that the problem in Central Asia has to do with the amount of water, the fact that it is insufficient, and given that water is a finite resource anyway, and the demands are growing, eventually the Central Asian republics are almost bound to go to war over that finite and depleted resources. The second has to do with the extent to which the resource is shared, and the extent to which resource management systems are not in place or are no longer in place or are no longer applied. Another factor that may affect the likelihood of conflicts/wars over water has to do with the relative power of riparian states. Power symmetry, or even a deadlock, would probably lead countries to think twice or 3 times before going to war with the neighbor. The weaker country would also think about 15 times before going to war with a much stronger neighbor, and yet a downstream country, which is militarily more powerful and stronger, could consider a military option to resolve a stalemate over the access and the distribution of water. And this was pretty much the situation that Central Asia was stuck in. Strong downstream countries in need of more water, facing poorer, smaller countries with a lot of water. So, given all these conditions, collapse of the command economy, disappearance of Moscow, contrasting interests and demands, and lack of a management system, we should have faced quite a bit of bloodshed in the region. And some bloodshed there was. But as I mentioned, it remained localized. One can think of one particular border where tensions tended to escalate on a repeated basis, and that was the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. And that's where border dwellers who had traditionally had shared access to water, land, and other resources found themselves in a situation where border were zigzagging so much through villages and across communities, if not even houses cut into by borders, that already in 1990 and then repeatedly communities start to clash at a very local level over the access and the distribution of water. The Tajik-Kyrgyz border is actually the only case, the only area where tensions continued to resurface. This is not to say that there were no problems in other parts of the region. There were problems on the Uzbek-Kazakh border because of the lack of the demarcation of the border, the lack of clarity over land rights, the actual positioning of the border on the land, the demarcation of the border. Similar tensions and problems existed, as I mentioned, on the Turkmen-Uzbek border, but again, despite the tensions between the two countries, they were quite escalated. So one would say that, fortunately enough, these type of tensions remain confined to one particular border. They were recurrent, but they always remained local. They never escalated at provincial level, let alone national level. Arguably, the extreme weakness of both parties, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, probably says much about why neither of the two actors eventually went to war with the other. Not only because there was an uncertain outcome, but also because there were no resources to be used over the war. So there were other conflicts over resources, at this time not over water. The Osh conflict is the usual suspect, where communities were at each other's throat, not so much because of the ethnicity that they belong to, although of course this is the mega narrative about these conflicts, but because of the way in which the overpopulation was impacting land access, the distribution of flats, the distribution of resources, but it was really primarily land, and what you could do on that land. That on two occasions, conflict over these shared resources escalated in June 1990, and then 20 years on between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz. There were smaller scale conflicts, again in small localities, typically in border regions, but again things remained tense at a very local level. Again, I do not mean to downplay these episodes. They were dramatic. There were losses of life. But an assessment has to be realistic, and eventually things could have turned out much worse. I really don't mean to be dismissive, but we should have expected the worst, and yet nothing happened. So the question here is, given that this was a conflict in the making, or a war over water in the making, there were a number of background factors that were leading in that direction. There were several triggers, most notably the collapse of a single state. And normally when you have a collapse of political order, there's a redistribution or a scramble for the redistribution of the small resources. You have a large Soviet pie, the Soviet state disappears, you have a smaller pie, and yet the same people sticking around. So there's basically a search for the smaller pie. So what happened, and why? And however, imperfect system of water governance eventually prevented an escalation of war or violence in any case. So what you have is a highly centralized system that collapses, and a situation whereby water ceases to be an all-union concern, or at the very least a regional concern or a shared concern, and becomes a national security issue. The central system has collapsed. Disputes can only be settled bilaterally. Moscow is no longer around, although one could argue that Moscow left, but he never did, given that it continued to play a role in Tajik politics. And still, when you look at the disputes between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan over these dammed projects, search for the control of territory. As I'm sure you remember at the beginning I had mentioned that if you looked at the Soviet map, if you take the globe, one thing that strikes us all is A, how colorful the map is, and B, how neatly drawn the lines of on the map are, except that reality is never like this. And the whole point about, reference about the bed of the river belonging to Tajikistan, or half of the road belonging to Tajikistan with the rest belonging to Kyrgyzstan, well illustrates this. What you had was thousands of border kilometers in need of demarcation, agreement, and then demarcation on the ground, which led to competition between the different states over territory. But control over territory obviously means a dispute over who controls the resources that are located on this territory. So it's obviously not only about the territory itself, but it's also about the resources there. The stakes were very high, and countries retaliated swiftly and with consequences that affected countries and the country's economy, and again affected the ordinary life of people. The fact that Tajikistan doesn't have the resources to pay for regularly for gas supplies from Uzbekistan, or at least runs huge debts, means that in retaliation Uzbekistan cuts off the gas supplies, which I think most people would find reasonable in contractual terms. Go back to the 2006 and 9 and 10 Russian-Ukrainian disputes over gas supplies. You want gas, you pay for gas. You don't pay for gas, sorry, people cut the bill. So from an economic point of view, or a legal point of view, that's what should happen. Except that obviously the stakes were much higher than just a purely legalistic or contractual dispute. So there were supply cuts, borders were shut, borders were mined, transport links were severed, and populations were cut off from access to water. So, heading towards the end of this part. So, what happened on paper? And the paper arrangements, however imperfect they were, still played a role in keeping tensions to a manageable level. So, if there's one thing that Central Asian presidents are very good at, is signing agreements. High-sounding, huge rhetoric involved. They're all, given the amount of books that they also write, or they are supposed to be writing, they're really graphomaniacs. So be it books or be texts of treaties, there's no shortage of ink being wasted in the region. So the first of these agreements that were supposed to regulate access and distribution of water was the agreement called Cooperation in the Field. Worthy is also an adjective that accompanies Central Asian leaders. The cooperation in the field of joint water resources management and conservation of interstate resources. So much for conciseness. Which basically recognized the unity of the region, one of the many rhetorical construction inherited from Soviet, and the community. So Central Asia is being constructed, at least at the rhetorical discursive level, as a unitary, a cohesive, and a coherent region. Except that a look at the different economies of the different republics suggests that the Central Asian economies are not complementary, they're actually competitive. But since regional cooperation is the mantra these days, then one doesn't want to go against the zeitgeist. And as a result, the Central Asian leaders in all of their treaties have restated the unity of purpose. So 1992 is a year where really we have a number of important treaties, landmark agreements that basically mean one simple thing, simple but important, namely that the agreements, the quota system, the allocation that existed, that was in vigor in Soviet times, remained in place in post-Soviet times. This was no small achievement, and definitely the outcome was not predetermined. the enforcer disappears, one country descends into a civil war, the others more or less have to reinvent themselves. Yet the presidents manage to agree, and they start to sign a number of agreements. One that sets up the main body that is supposed to regulate these particular issues, the Interstate Commission for Water Coordination, based in Tashkent. Then you have a number of other agreements that are aimed at regulating water distribution in the region as a whole, and smaller agreements that deal with the RLC because of the scale of the tragedy. So here we have the establishment of the Interstate Council for the RLC in 1993, the International Fund for the RLC, that is a merger between the two, where eventually you only have the the fund for the RLC as the body that with which the political authority, decision-making power, is supposed to stay when it comes to guiding the functioning and the operation of the commission. So the commission has the technical authority, political authority resides with the fund. So far so good. Okay, no Moscow, no war. Things are working out all right. The quota system is in place. Looks like life had never changed. The problem is that similarly to all the other plethora of regional organizations that have mushroomed in the region, Central Asia and the post-Soviet region more broadly, these kind of agreements end up in this very formal, apparently cordial, actually useless meetings of elites that, apart from congratulating each other, have one fundamental flaw. And the flaw is simple, and yet is consequential. That is, the institutional framework doesn't function. The institutional framework that was set up in 92 and 93 to ensure that the collapse of the command economy, the emergence of 5 different and very often divergent national policies would not lead to the implosion of the region, a possible competition of war for resources, didn't quite work out, or at least was not as efficient and effective as it should have been. There were a number of problems for this. First, what appeared to be the lack of determination of the actual elites, read the president. The dominance, even just in terms of pure numbers, of officials from one country, in this case Uzbekistan, in these commissions. The lack of coordination between agencies, national and international, so that you would have donors, NGOs, states, all interested and probably goodwill, moving into approaching the issue and providing resources and advice, providing impulse but no coordinated strategy. So what was left was meetings and an institutional framework which existed on paper but was in fact very problematic. And because the formal agreements basically remain formal, whereas the political, social, and economic hardship of the Central Asian republics was real, it had effects on the country's GDP, and it had effect on the ordinary life of ordinary people. Each republic started to develop its own course, meaning developed its own priorities, political and economic. And because this development of policies was not coordinated with the neighbors, led to the emergence of contrasting priorities. So, for Tajikistan, the 2 main priorities with regard to water was the expansion of irrigated land. Most of Tajikistan lies above 3,000 meters. 7% of Tajikistan's land is arable. A population that has grown dramatically from 4 million in the early post-Soviet time period to about 7. Okay, there's a large number of Tajik citizens residing outside of Tajikistan, but nonetheless, the demand for water is enormous, to the point that, well, while the state is demanding or is trying to prioritize the irrigated land, Tajik citizens are actually moving into the territory of some neighboring countries that are being emptied by the out-migration of the citizens of this other country. And the country I have in mind here is Kyrgyzstan, and that's the obvious, the fairly well-known phenomenon called creeping migration, whereby the collapse of the economy in southern Kyrgyzstan, particularly in the Batken province, is leading southern Kyrgyzstani citizens to leave southern Kyrgyzstan, move to Bishkek or Russia, with the land being taken over legally or semi-legally or illegally by Tajik citizens that basically use it for growing rice. Hydropower capacity is one priority for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan also prioritizes food self-sufficiency. Uzbekistan continues to prioritize the cotton economy. Uzbekistan has become food secure and food self-sufficient a long time ago. So what is driving Uzbekistan in this regard is the achievement of food surplus, so that similarly to, say, neighboring Kazakhstan, it could actually export food. So you can see here that there are really contrasting priorities that lead, unsurprisingly, to divergent policies, contrasting policies. And in a context where you don't have a regime, a set of rules that are clear and that are enforced, what you're left is a situation where you have a bit of a problem, but you hope for the best. So I'll stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much for this. I'd like to know what's your opinion about the new aspect of water governance, climate change, that is adding heavily to water scarcity, and water governance in a way in these countries is coordinated through the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, through the communication on progress that every country has to submit to them, which has water catchment management aspects, food security, land use, land degradation, everything. And obviously, since even Lake Balaton here in Hungary is listed already among the threat lakes and catchments for eutrophication, being so shallow, the conflict over water worldwide will become very fierce.
Let me start with your last sentence, around which there seems to be a consensus, and as a result, a proliferation of publications about the looming wars over water in Asia, Africa, or elsewhere. That may well be the case, although a look at the historical record suggests that over the last 3,000 years, the number of interstate wars has been remarkably low, to the point that, again, without downplaying the risk, we may be facing a situation of the usual dog that doesn't bark. A situation which is supposed to happen. You expect countries to go to war over resources and over war, but this doesn't happen. So that may be possible, and I think that the Central Asian example suggests that this is a possibility. That eventually a very critical situation in a very vulnerable region eventually doesn't escalate. But that takes me to the previous point, which I think speaks to some of the issues that I've tried to highlight. Namely that it is, I think I'm discovering hot water when I say that unless you have political will and functioning institutions, meaning strong polities, the risk is that you will end up in contexts like the Central Asian one with a number of agreements and formal commitment to whatever the United Nations presents these countries with, but very little in terms of implementation. So I think that the problem in Central Asia is not in terms of commitment, it's not in terms of formal commitment and in terms of what these countries can sign up to. The problem is that when it comes to actual implementation, there is very little in terms of political will to ensure that part of the country's sovereignty, which is very jealously guarded, can be either ceded, shared, or pooled in favor of agreements or regimes that can regulate this kind of problems. So all this to say that what really matters is questions of one of the determinants to see whether these kind of commitments actually translate into practice. The question of state capacity and state strength. And you're very unlikely to have contexts like the Central Asian one, South Asian to some extent, where anything apart from rhetoric should be expected. So when we look at the attempts to ensure a regional water governance system, not only in Central Asia but also in Central Asia, the examples that pop up are always the same. The Danube system, the Rhine system, only to find out that these are very problematic examples to be transposed to the region. These are regimes that are in place between countries that are viable and have a good degree of state capacity. State capacity, and even sovereignty as a whole, are criteria that I think are fundamental to ensure that regimes, cooperation agreements, regime, water governance regimes, are implemented and respected. Countries whose sovereignty is a bit questionable or a bit weak, at least internal sovereignty, countries with a very weak state capacity are probably going to be unlikely implementers. So all this to say that I don't expect the Central Asian states to defect from global agreements. Quite the opposite. The Central Asian countries will probably sign up to whatever they're presented with. Whatever problem, on the basis of experience with the water resource management system inherited from the Soviet period, whatever problem with is the actual will or commitment of the Central Asian leaders to actually stick with what they signed. Is it too vague as an answer? Yeah.
I've got two questions for you. First one is more of a historical. How were these matters solved in the older days when there was, so to speak, a different institutional setup and the Emirate of Bukhara, for example, at the end of the 19th century and no more than that? That's the first question. And then secondly, being an ecological economist, it's very interesting to see the numbers. So who extracts this water? What's the distribution by sector? Is it industrial or household, agricultural? And those types of do you have those figures?
Well, not with me today. So what I was trying to do was to give a general overview on this. I'm not an economist myself, so I do see where you're coming from. I targeted the presentation to that particular audience. Farming and agriculture is where the water is being channeled to primarily. The exception being the cotton sector in Uzbekistan.
So, and it's abstracted directly by farmers, or there is some system in place?
No. Sorry. What I had in mind, sorry, that I misunderstood the question.
Well, there were different sides to it. But is it all sort of just directly used by farmers, or there are some institutional systems in place?
But there is a channel, canal system, and a fairly articulated one as well. So while farmers at a very local level may help themselves, and that's part of the problem, because that's where you would have the border disputes with farmers helping themselves with water, the system is fairly, you do have canals, but it's not, it's a very modern part of the world, so you have canals. The problem is what people do with those canals, with communities helping themselves with water that flows through those canals, and with the decaying infrastructure, meaning that some of the problems are man-made, and some of the problems are still man-made, but are more the result of, say, weather conditions, desiccation. So to go back to your question, there is a problem that has to do with how farmers use or abuse water. Otherwise, you have canals, you have an irrigation system, you have.
To put it very simply,
yes.
Do you have a diagram which shows how the annual flow is actually used by country and by sector?
Not here.
And what about the first question?
Yeah.
What happened before the Soviet Union? Because and how did it work before? Because as far as I understand that, for example, RLC started disappearing in 1950s, 1960s, yes? So it was during the Soviet Union's, so actually it wasn't good solutions, yes? Because maybe I'm confused, but as far as I understand, you said that actually the central planning administration was better than this national water policy based on the international agreements. Maybe we should improve the international agreements, international cooperation, instead of going to central planning administration. Because how was it before? Because
the problem was not so much with central planning. I'm not an advocate of communism. Or even if I were, it would be irrelevant here. No, but I mean the question is irrelevant. I mean I don't care what people's ideological and economic preferences are. The point is that the problem is not with the command economy as such. The problem was with the priorities that the Soviet Union had in terms of industrial policies. So those, and how they were enacted. So in principle, if you have shared resources in the region and you had a single actor that decided how these resources were managed and distributed, then it could be an efficient and cost-effective way to handle the situation in a way that would be as legitimate as a situation where the 5 countries that share the water agreeing on a regime that regulates this management. So you could have either these actors that agree between themselves, or you have a single actor.
But what was before the Soviet Union? Do you have data, like how the situation looked like? They have the resources, they have access to water.
Well, the Central Asian history is defined by water. The Central Asian economy in the pre-modern period, so the Emirate of Bukhara, is built around the use of water. I mean, these were hydraulic societies, basically. These were societies that were pre-industrial. So, in a way, going back to your question, I find it very difficult to compare the two for 2 reasons. The first is that we are comparing modern polities with very clearly demarcated boundaries with polities that were not states. In the Emirate of Bukhara or the Khanate of Bukhara was a system that was built around the loyalty to the person, not to institutions. The boundaries were fuzzy and moving, so it's difficult to see how the 2 polities could be compared. They're incommensurable in a way. The other reason that I find it difficult to compare the 2 is that one polity was a pre-industrial one. The second went through a very, very accelerated modernization and industrialization, which I see as the problem. So the problem for me, again, I do see the inefficiencies that come out of the command economy. That's obvious. The problem for me is less that than the actual choices that were made on the basis of the possibility provided by the command economy. So the command economy was an opportunity for the center to make choices. The problem is not so much how you get there, the problem was the choices that were made. because those were the policies that led to the catastrophic consequences and the legacies that Central Asia has now, both in terms of the environment, but in terms of the monoculture, the specialization, the inefficiencies. One can obviously argue that it's inevitable to have inefficiencies in a command economy, but choices were made. And so the problem is with the choices and the elites that made those choices. I think that the problems lie. So the economic and the ecological legacies that the Central Asian societies face now are the result of the policies of the 1920s and 30s, not of the policies of the Amir of Bukhara. But again, that's not to say that that was a fantastic model polity, but the problems originated in the 1920s and 30s as far as I see.
Okay, I think we take one more question,
sure.
Because you start consuming time of your coffee break. And I don't want to be accused for torturing your classes. So one more question, and we will continue then. And I think after the second lecture we have more, because food security is closely related to water.
Yeah, I have a question about the issue of security and water, because the problem in Kyrgyzstan, for example, is that we have a lot of uranium tailings ponds and other radioactive waste. And in some rivers already we have cracks in tailings ponds, and they're flowing into the river. So far we haven't had major ecological catastrophe, but it can happen because we are earthquake prone. So my question is, how do you think, is it possible to have an efficient regional cooperation to really discuss and do something about it? Because of course I do agree that it's a lot of, there's a lot of formality involved with no real commitments at the end, but especially in case of radioactive waste and river, in the rivers. What do you think could be the possible solution so that the governments take it seriously?
Well, I suppose that the trigger for a cooperation agreement would be if the downstream country directly affected by this started to be unable to use water for this particular reason. In that case, you would have a resource which would be unusable by both the upstream and downstream country.
How about before, as a preventive measure?
Well, you have you have probably three options there. You have a bilateral deal, you have a regional agreement, or you have an agreement that is enforced by a third party.
Which third party?
With Moscow no longer available, there are a number of actors that have tried to do something in the region, the latest of which is the European Union with its own water strategy. There is no shortage of third parties. You could have the Asia Development Bank if funding comes from a particular source. Given the way in which Central Asian statehood has emerged from the last 20 years, with such an important emphasis placed on sovereignty, it seems to me that really the most realistic prospect at the short term is a bilateral agreement between the two parties concerned. I find it difficult to see what the incentives, the mechanisms, the sanctions for failing to abide by the agreement could be. Should the regime be regional, or should the agreement be promoted by a third party? I think that a bilateral deal seems to be the obvious place to go. This obviously, I conclude, doesn't take into consideration the fact that very often even the most elementary deals in the region between two countries have been hampered by the rivalry between the countries. And Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan relations are actually a good example of this. There are a number of good reasons why the two countries should cooperate on water-related matters. But for the past 20 years, as you were very well aware, very little has been done because of poor political relations between the two countries. So, to go back to your question, realistically, a bilateral deal that still may not become possible in a condition where bilateral relations are plagued by personal rivalries between the president. With the help of biology, things improved. Uzbek-Turkmen relations were very poor, and then Niyazov moved on. And some of the bones of contention between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan started to be addressed. So, biology helps a lot.
Okay, on this positive note, we finish first part of the lecture, and we continue at 11:30, not 11:31. Two small questions. First of all, those who supposed to present yesterday case studies,